Right, you can tell first of all that they were a really rich family, because we're talking about the sort of the earliest photograph on here was actually when he was 22 years old, so that's 1866. So most people didn't have any access to having a photograph unless you were really wealthy and you could commission someone to come in and do a family portrait. The one at the very top when he was 7 years old is obviously like a pencil drawing, and this is actually this is actually taken from W.H. Allen's family photo album, which is in the archives at the back of Borough Hall, and it's like a montage that obviously the family put together, and he signed it as well. Right, so he's born in Cardiff, when he's just 2 years old. It's just him and his sister, and their father died. Apparently, he used to go to London quite a bit to sort of try and keep up with sort of the trends in the gastronomy trade. And on one of those trips, he contracted pneumonia and died sort of quite suddenly. He was only about 30 years old. So he left the sort of mum and 2 kids with loads and loads of money, obviously, so that probably helped. 1851, they were living in Duke Street in Cardiff, and we've been looking this up, and the part of Duke Street that's still there is actually a really small road, and if you look out the front window of any of the houses, you see Cardiff Castle, the main entrance to Cardiff Castle and the main wall. So again, it wasn't a rundown area of Cardiff that they lived, it was actually quite a well-to-do upmarket area of Cardiff where they were living. So his mum was sort of really keen to sort of make sure the 2 children didn't suffer, so she was really keen to sort of improve their education and so on. So William Henry Allen ended up getting sent to a private school in Weston-super-Mare. And again, we've been looking at whereabouts that was. It's on Beach Road in Weston-super-Mare, which, as the name suggests, it actually faces right into the seafront. You know, you look out the front windows of the school and you'll see the promenade and the sea beyond it. He then went to Christ College in Brecon. When he was about 15, it changes in sort of different accounts. Between 15 and 19, his mum bought him a foundry and an old factory. You know, sort of most kids that age would be quite happy with a bike, you know, a PlayStation if it's these days. You know, the mum went out, I thought I'd buy him a factory. So obviously she was really keen that he was going to get sort of a proper grounding in some sort of trade. He ended up then being an apprentice at Wern Foundry in Llanelli. And apparently when he was there, the manager of the works actually spoke to him on the first day, and apparently never spoke to him again for about 5 years until he actually left the apprenticeship, and that was the only time he spoke to him again. And because of that, he sort of vowed that if he actually had his own company, he wouldn't be like that. He'd actually look after the welfare of his workers and their education and how they're getting on, rather than just speaking to them at the beginning and the end of their time with the factory. Apparently when he sort of left, he actually sort of got a little bundle of papers, which turned out to be a copy of Pilgrim's Progress. So it's quite ironic that he ended up being in Bedford, you know, where obviously the book was written in the prison. Yeah, so it says 1863, Mum buys him an old foundry and forge in Cardiff, but I think it was, according to his a speech that he gave, it was actually when he was about 15, so he's still at school. His mum bought him the foundry. 1865, he married Anne Mary Pemberton Howell. Apparently they sort of met at the local church. He was a really keen churchgoer and played the organ at the local church in Llanelli, and that's where they met and ended up getting married. The other thing about his apprenticeship, apparently he lived the other side of Brecon Beacons, so he had a 4-mile trip over Brecon Beacons every morning to make sure he got there for the 7:30 starting. So he also got quite a tough upbringing. Eventually he got rid of the foundry. Apparently there's a few problems because his brother-in-law started running the foundry while he was still doing his apprenticeship, and they just didn't get on at all. And when he sort of turned up, he ended up just being the foreman, even though he owned the company, he owned the factory. He ended up being the foreman in his own factory, and he wasn't happy with that. He decided he wanted to be more ambitious. He wanted to move to London. That's where all the engineering business seemed to be kicking off. Apparently he applied to 3 different companies, and all of them turned him down. And then after about 3 days, a place called Gwynn & Company that made lots of sort of pumping equipment, they got in touch and said, actually, we might have a job for you. And he went down to London, had an interview. He didn't have any sort of CV or anything, any credentials, but they liked him and they took him on straight away. He ended up practically running the whole business. He said he was the manager, the cashier, the foreman, the lot, you know. So again, it was a good sort of grounding in what was to come. The fact he was doing just about every single job. Apparently the boss never turned up for a couple of years, his last 2 years there. And I think in the end he got a bit fed up with that, and he definitely wanted his own company, and he ended up forming his own company, WH Allen & Co, and that's where Maurice is going to pick up the story. But we started looking at the places that he lived. So again, he was obviously making a good living, because he started living in Kensington with his wife, 2 daughters, and had just the 2 servants. He then moved to Marylebone. I was hoping to find a picture of that, but I've actually found online the actual street and the actual number. That one building has been knocked down, and there's just all scaffolding up where they're building something else in the gap. But it was quite a fancy area, as you'd expect with Marylebone. And by then he had 2 daughters, 4 sons, still just the 2 servants. And then we found that he was living in Westminster at something called One Dean's Yard. And straight away I thought, that sounds like a little back street. You know, Westminster's obviously quite a wealthy area, but Dean's Yard actually sounds like a really little back street. So I went down last week, thought I'll find where this Dean's Yard is. Well, by then he had at least 8 children. Not that they couldn't keep count, there were 2 that died in infancy, and there are 2 that when you come to his family tree in a minute, there's just a question mark, so I'm not sure if they died very young as well. But he had at least 8, not quite a football team, but getting close. Right, so that's actually the entrance to Dean's Yard. Go through that thing, so yeah, it's quite a little rundown back street, as I thought. We go to the archway, and it's the first building on your right. And that's how it looks these days. It's actually used now as an office for the people that work at Westminster Abbey, which just happens to be around the corner. The building itself was actually designed by Sir George Gilbert Scott, quite a famous architect. He did things like the St Pancras Hotel, the Albert Memorial, almost every cathedral in Great Britain he had something to do with either renovating or adding bits. So really top architect, and this just happens to be number 1 Dean's Court. So basically, if you come down these 7 steps from the front door, turn left, go to the archway, that's the site that you get. It's right as near as you can get to living next door to Westminster Abbey. So it's an incredible sort of place to have. I wouldn't have thought that was too cheap to sort of buy that house or rent it or whatever they did. Yeah, so you literally come to the archway and you see that. So amazing place to live. Right, 1886, just after they sort of moved to that place next to Westminster Abbey, his wife died. She was only 39, but she'd given birth to 12 children. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So, someone said, what did she die of? You know, work it out, do the maths. Someone also, I did another talk about famous people doing Queen's Park, and they said, so what did his wife do? And I said, well, just kept making babies, basically. You know, I don't think she had another job. But he did have quite a few servants. A year after she died, he got married to Madeline Agnew Fedden. I've been trying to work out the relation, but she was actually his brother-in-law's niece. So again, this the brother-in-law is the man that he didn't get on with at the factory that he owned. So it's his niece that he ended up marrying. The same year his mum died, and then another year later they had a 13th child. And then in 1890, this is a bit of a weird one, because Richard Allen, his oldest son, married his stepmom's sister. I'm not very good on word calculations anyway, but it just gets far too complicated. I thought at that point I'm going to stop delving, because there'll be some other things going on. So this is the family tree. It's a really fancy coat of arms. The reason the ship is on there, it goes back to the shipping business that his great-great-grandfather set up. And basically all this line across the top there, that's all the children. You see there's a couple of question marks. And it's mainly by the women actually, because all the men, just about all of them, ended up working in Allen's, ended up in sort of management roles. George Pemberton Allen was the architect for all of Allen's buildings and this place here as well, the church. And you notice that there's quite a few lines of it have got the word Gwyn in it. That was from his first sort of main job, the pumping company that he worked for in London. So obviously he had quite a nice connection because he actually had that as the middle name for the whole branch of his family. But yeah, a very fancy coat of arms there from his lively book stamp. Right, so we're trying to figure out exactly where W.H. Allen's first business is, and I realise this is a place I go to quite a bit because, as well as local history, I'm also a really keen photographer of graffiti, and this is the only sort of authorised graffiti area in London, or it was. I think most places you can do it now, get away with it. So that little tunnel where the blue arrow is pointing to, that's a tunnel that's closed off at one end because it used to be the taxi rank for the Eurostar when it's based at Waterloo Station. So basically, Allen's, and Morris has done a lot of research on this, worked out the map, and actually where Allen's was actually directly underneath that structure. That was actually Building of the Year in 1994, I think it was, before they started doing the Stirling Prize, designed by the same architect that did the Eden project down in the sort of West Country. So somewhere underneath there is the foundations of Allen's first business. And luckily, at the moment, they're doing a lot of developing in that area, and it's actually going to be a nice, bright, new, shiny concourse. So at some point in that building works, they may well have come across some of the little remnants of the original W.H. Allen's factory. Right, at that point, I'm going to hand over to Morris, who's going to tell you more about the business from then on.
Right, so we've got the factory underneath part of Waterloo Station, and here we have a drawing of the factory for York Street in Lambeth, purchased in 1880. It was a bit run down. It had been owned previously by Merriweather and Sons, who were one of the most famous manufacturers of fire engines at the time. They had two factories at the time in London, and then opened a much bigger one in Greenwich. And they let this one run to seed a little bit, and the one that they had in Covent Garden, well, for a fire engine manufacturers, it burnt down. So they amalgamated both of their factories into the new one at Greenwich and decided to sell it off relatively cheaply. And they actually leased it to start off with to Allen's, and that was basically their first factory in 1880. And soon started making the pumps and generators that they became famous for. These are some of their early orders. 1884, at the top there's two Cunard liners called the Etruria and the Umbria. They were the first two large vessels that W.H. Allen's made pumping equipment and electrical equipment for. It was mainly pumps in that one. It's a bit, those two liners are actually the end of an era because they're the last large liners that actually had provision for sails as well. Afterwards, they would have masts, but they wouldn't actually be able to be rigged with sails. They were 1884. They had one small contract with the Admiralty in 1884 as well, but in 1885 they received their first major order from the Admiralty, and this is for steam-powered generators to provide electricity for two battleships that were built, two sister ships, HMS Devastation and HMS Thunderer. And how many of you recognise the matchbox? It's quite a famous make of matchbox. The ship that's actually on the matchbox is the HMS Devastation. This is the reason why I've got a picture of the matchbox. The ship, the photograph is also HMS Devastation. The Thunderer was almost identical in shape. It was, they were sister ships, both battleships. There's a couple of photographs of the staff in the York Street workforce outside the works in 1880. As a little bit precarious. I don't know what they're all sitting or standing on. It doesn't look health and safety these days would think too much of it. And the other one's quite an interesting photograph. It's the famous explorer, Sir Henry Morton Stanley, famous for finding David Livingstone when he'd gone missing in darkest Africa. The person who said, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. This is him. He was quite old at the time. He was looking a bit haggard there, but he'd obviously paid a visit to the factory building for some reason. And there's W.H. Allen here in the front with him. And this is the site of the factory. Up the top here is Waterloo Station, and Waterloo Station being the largest station with the most number of platforms in London and in the country. All the train lines actually funneled through a bit of a gap here where they all squeezed together, and York Street Works, this bit here and this little triangular bit, that was W.H. Allen's factory. The other interesting thing on this is on the other side is the Necropolis station. Necropolis, literally City of the Dead. And that was a special station to carry coffins out of London to a cemetery in the countryside. Because London churches are running short of space, several companies bought up large areas of land. This particular company, the Necropolis company, they bought a large amount of land just outside Woking in Surrey to have an enormous cemetery, and they had a daily train that used to carry the coffins and the mourners out to be buried. And you could have a first class, second class or third class funeral, and you've got different privileges depending on how much you paid.
Oh, right.
The first class one, you could actually go on the platform and see your coffin being loaded. The train could hold up to 48 coffins. The third class one, everyone was in the third class waiting room, and they loaded up all the third class ones. When you got to the cemetery, the first class burial, you had a proper service, you could choose which plot you wanted, and you could put a memorial or stone on it. Third class ones, all the third class ones had one service for the whole lot, and then you were put on, you had an individual plot. You had an individual plot, but you weren't allowed to put a stone on it, unless you upgraded to a second class one. Which some people did, they upgraded later because they paid a little bit extra and got the second class one. But one of the problems was, and if you can also see, the signal box. Now, the railway company have been trying to buy land off of Merryweather's to start off with, and also off of W.H. Allen's. And they actually succeeded in buying odd little strips of land. One strip of land they bought was only 6 inches wide, but some of them were slightly bigger. There's at least 3 occasions they bought a small strip of land. But there was problems. This part here was the main foundry, this triangular bit. The signal box, there wasn't room for a signal box at the side of the track, so it went across the track. And then, of course, there's this Necropolis station. The foundry, any foundry is going to have lots of smoke and fumes and gases and noxious anything. Although it's not named although W.H. Allen's is not named in any of the things I've seen, people from the Necropolis station, both the people operating it and mourners, were complaining about the smoke and fumes coming from across the track. And said it was like a vision of hell in London when they're sending their dearly departed off. And the signal box, people working in the signal box were being overcome by the fumes, which not only was unsafe for them, but the fact that they were controlling all the trains going in and out of Waterloo was not particularly good for the train company either.
What's the date of that?
That map is 1892. And this is a close-up of what's called a goad map, which is, goad maps are made especially for industries and things like that, because they're made for the fire insurance companies. So they actually did very detailed maps. This is the foundry here, in that triangular bit. And these dotted lines there, that's the signal box. So you can see that the signal box was literally a few feet away from the foundry. And this is actually a photograph I managed to find of the signal box. Managed to get this photograph from the National Railway Museum in York. And as you can see, the signal, the actual box is across the track. They've even got windows open on this one. So this W.H. Allen's factory would have been there at the time. Eventually, the railway company was really wanted to get rid of the factory completely and clear the site so that not only they could expand the tracks, but also they could stop the pollution, basically. And they agreed to. They asked how much it was going to cost to buy the land, to buy the site. W.H. Allen, off the top of his head, offered 40,000. They ummed and ahed and came back with 35, but he was quite shrewd. He thought, well, if they're only offering just a little bit less, I'm going to hold out for the 40,000. So he got the 40,000. All he needed now was to find somewhere to start to move his factory to.
That must have been a lot of money.
Yes. There was about $1 million-ish.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, maybe slightly more. So, there's the tale about how he came to Bedford. No. I think that could be completely ruled out. Bedford wasn't the first choice. He tried various areas in Surrey, further down the same railway line. And he'd also tried some areas in Essex as well. He didn't want to be too far away from London. He wanted to be close to a railway line in order to for goods coming in and stuff he'd manufactured to be taken by rail. He needed a ready population of people, preferably who were skilled in working with metals. That he was always going to take a core of his own workers with him, but it was apparently someone called John Kempster who had been working there in London with him since 1889, who suggested Bedford. There were some Kempsters in the Bedford area. There was a vicar in the Sandy Biggleswade area as a Kempster, and I haven't worked out whether he's actually a relative or not. But one of the other things which made Bedford a good place to go to was it was known to have a reasonable supply of people who were skilled in foundry work and work with metals. Mainly because of the Howard factory Britannia Works. And they, in fact, hadn't been doing that well in the 1880s and early 1890s because there was a slump in agricultural sort of dealings across the whole country. So with them making ploughs and other agricultural things, there was actually a surplus of workers who were skilled in the Bedford area. But this is a sort of, well, it's a watercolour of the site. This comes out of one of the early magazines, Allen's magazines. And this is supposedly cutting the first sod, or turf, January the 20th, 1894. The main story about him coming to Bedford, and there's been so many different ones, he was passing through, he's coming back from the north, he was heading for the Midlands. It was a deliberate, he deliberately came to Bedford. He'd actually been to various auction houses, the places that deal with sale of land and premises. And there's still, most of the stories seem to involve a young boy running after him down the street and saying, we know where there's some land. whatever happened, he'd gone to a solicitor onto Paul Square and had seen that the land was just pretty well what he wanted, the land by the side of the railway track, and it paid a 10% deposit, and the transaction was all over in a few hours. Well, I don't think it was. I can't find any. It mentions it in the book and in other things that Whitbread owned the land, but I don't think he did. He didn't own the land that the rest of the land in Queen's Park. Ashburnhams owned quite a lot of the land in a big strip where the railway was. Whether they had something to do with it, but who the original owner of the land is a bit of a mystery. But anyway, it was bought. This was cutting the first sod. That was in November 1893. January the next year, cutting the first sod. But you notice there's actually 4 people in this photograph. There's one there holding the horse, and there's 4 of them, 3 there, so 4 in total. Here becomes a bit of a mystery. And again, this is a close-up of it from in the book about Allen's. Again, the 4 of them there. This is the original photograph from the archives. We've got a missing person. And also, the other thing that's quite noticeable is that he's quite a lot brighter. So I actually tried to find out what the weather forecast was for that day. The local papers didn't have any weather for that day, but the national paper, the Times, had a weather forecast for that particular day in January 1894 was dull and very dull and cloudy, which it pretty well looks dull and cloudy in the background. But this person looks quite brightly lit, and he's not in this one. So it looks like a sort of an 1890s Photoshop. Almost certainly, I think he's been cut out from another photograph and put in that photograph. And also, they've said cutting the first turf. There's quite a lot of turf cut there. They're certainly not cutting the first turf in that photograph. There's all this piles of turf all the way along here, down here, and in the foreground. So whether they started doing stuff and then W.H. Allen turned up and they said, right, we need to get this photograph taken, or what happened, but certainly there's a mystery man in there. And I think we're going to call that the first half, I think. Yeah. So that's going to be the first half. There's going to have a quick break for tea and refreshments if you so wish, which have been served out the back. And we'll draw the raffle, and then I'm going to continue on. It's going to take you up to around about the start of the Second World War. In the second. So here's another photograph that's actually taken on the same day, January the 20th, 1894. These are the backs of the houses, some of the houses that have been built on Hurst Grove, and this is looking up towards Bromham Road on that photograph. As I say, the land was purchased in November, or at least the deposit was paid, and the first cut in January the next year. The machinery from the York Street Works started being transferred late summer, sort of August, September time, and then in September, around about 100 or just over 100 of the original workforce transferred up to Bedford. And the new factory was up and running in the next month or so. There's a few photographs of it being built. This is quite an early one. This virtually nothing had been done, just the footings and things like that. This would be where the offices would be. The new extension to the railway bridge over Ford End Road. And the chimney in the background is from the coking works at the gasworks. And there's obviously some quite sort of primitive scaffolding going up around there as the building's progressing. This is from March. And then I've got 4 more photographs of various parts of the construction. The steelwork apparently came from Bristol, but all the brickwork and everything like that was done locally by local builders. And these are from April to May 1894. You can see things starting to progress quite nicely in most of these parts. And by the end of the year, invites were sent out to a lot of his industrial contacts, inviting people to come and have a look at the new factory. And you've got a drawing of the factory with the office building, the pattern shop, which is where the other newer office building was built, which is then obviously the brand new one, the latest one was on the site of the first bit, and the factory went back quite a little way, although it expanded very rapidly after in the first few years, which I'll show you in a second. So the 1894 factory was really just a few units down the bottom. By 1900 it had doubled in size, and by 1910 the Allen Club had been opened, and also it had been stretching more than halfway up the side of the railway. They were quite innovative right from the word go, in that, for instance, when W.H. Allen arranged the insurance for the factory, as well as the insurance for the factory building itself, he took out an extra insurance that if any of his workers suffered a fatal accident at work, the family would get £50, which was something that most factory owners didn't do anything like that. It was an added thing that he'd put in on top of the insurance, and that was right from the word go in the 1890s. And in 1897, to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria, he also donated a fund to provide a pension for workers who'd done long service and faithful service to him. So again, it's a very early sort of pension scheme. W.H. Allen himself was someone these days would probably get the latest iPhone or whatever. Anything that came out, is one of the very first people to have a motor car in Bedford. This is the 1903-1904 phone book. This is the entire phone book for Bedford. You should see the one underneath is actually Chelmsford. It's only got about four items, four names in it. And you'll see that W.H. Allen got number 1. So his phone number was Bedford 1. John Kempster, who is his chief electrical engineer, and the person who, according to W.H. Allen himself, was responsible for sort of discovering Bedford or pointing out Bedford as a good choice. He also was in charge of most of the moving of the equipment up from London to Bedford. He left the company in 1902 to work for Harland and Wolff, and very quickly became a director in 1906, and he was managing director by the time the First World War started. And he's almost, no doubt, influenced some of the major orders from the shipyard later on in the decade. This was their first magazine, came out in April 1904, was the cover of it. Again, it was something that not many companies had their own works magazine. He was very keen on promoting not only the news about the company to the workers and ex-employees, also to be able to give employers a good sort of basic knowledge of all sorts of technical advances. But most of the magazines had, in those days, quite technical papers inside about various engineering things. 1904, W.H. Allen was made High Sheriff of the county of Bedfordshire, and he brought out quite a nice little book that has all sorts of things to do with his year as sheriff. It happened to be the year when they unveiled the Boer War Memorial that's outside the Swan Hotel. So this is W.H. Allen in front of it, unveiling it and giving the speech.
Lady Cooper, wasn't it?
Oh, Lady Cooper did. Yes, Lady Cooper did, but he was
officiating. Yes.
He was officiating. Yes. October 1905, on the 25th anniversary of the founding of the company, it was announced that they would build an institute on Hurst, which is going to be built on Hurst Grove for use as a dining room for the workers and also for entertainment purposes as well. So, Allen's Institute, which is the Allen Club eventually, opened in August 1907, and these are some early photographs from when it first opened. And the idea was that you'd use it as a dining hall during the day or for meetings and things like that, and in the evening you use for recreational purposes. And these are just a few pictures of the inside of it. The smoke room. It's sort of a couple of tables with an ashtray in the middle. Well, I'm quite interested. I'm pretty sure that might be a spittoon underneath that table in the games room. It's all set up. You can tell it's set up for dominoes and crib.
They had one room for foreman only.
Yes. But the dining hall, they've been doing renovation work in there. We went in there a couple of years ago now, but there doesn't seem to be anyone around at the moment. Everything seems to have stopped there. But we managed to get in and they showed us around, and they're actually, they took out, in later years they had put in false ceilings and all sorts of things, but they've actually stripped all that out. So the original ceiling is now visible. And out the back, we took some photographs. So there's an old iron range, which is obviously part of the original kitchen, out the back. I don't know what they've done with that, whether they've actually scrapped that out, because we haven't managed to get in to see what's like in there at the moment. From about 1906-ish onwards, they had some major contracts with some of the most well-known firms doing transatlantic trips on liners, etc. And just going to go through just a few of their ones from their heyday. There's the Lusitania and the Mauretania, which are sister ships. The Lusitania was the largest and fastest ship in the world until the launch of its sister ship, which was only about 2 months afterwards. It was overtaken in size and in speed by the Mauretania. Obviously, the Lusitania was famously sunk by a German U-boat, and it's caused all sorts of problems. Anti-German riots in Bedford. The Crown on Britannia Road was ransacked because it was owned by someone with a German name, who actually was a naturalised Briton, who'd actually lived in Britain for 30 years. But they smashed all the windows in the Crown, and in fact the police couldn't cope. They had to get the military in from Kempston Barracks to quell the mob. And there's also, somewhere in St Peter's, someone with a German-sounding name also had their windows smashed in. The Mauretania was launched, say, only a few months after the Lusitania, and that became the largest ship in the world at the time. And it held the blue ribbon from 1907 till 1929, so 20-odd years. After the sinking of the Lusitania, that was refitted first as a hospital ship and then as a troop carrier, particularly bringing troops over from Canada and from the United States. And this is a picture of it in its famous dazzle colours that they painted a lot of the ships in the First World War. And this is the famous order for 8 generators, 4 for the RMS Olympic and 4 for the RMS Titanic. A lot of people say it shouldn't be HMS. No, RMS means Royal Mail Ship, so it was basically a British registered ship that was licensed to carry mail. Sometimes it stood for Royal Mail Steamer, but Royal Mail Ship was the normal thing. So they're all RMS and not HMS, which would only be used for naval vessels. This is the letter from Pirrie, Lord Pirrie, who was the owner of Harland and Wolff, and handwritten order to dear Mr. Allen for the 8 generators, the contract price of £20,000. And here's the 2 ships together, HMS Olympic and the HMS RMS Olympic and the RMS Titanic next to it in Belfast. Obviously, the Titanic famously sank on its first voyage. The Olympic actually had quite a successful life as an ocean liner. It was fairly eventful. It did keep hitting things. It was hit by a navy vessel on its way, even before the Titanic incident. But it did ram a U-boat. It was one of the only recorded example during the First World War of a civilian vessel, a liner, successfully sinking a U-boat. But it also hit a light ship accidentally in fog in the 1920s. The Britannic was the largest of the lot. It was going to be called the Gigantic, but because it sounded too much like the Titanic, it's still in its early stages of being built. They thought they needed to change the name, so they called it Britannic. And it wasn't fitted out until the First World War had actually broken out. So they stripped out all the cabins and put large open areas for carrying wounded soldiers and as used as a hospital ship. Unfortunately, it hit a mine off the coast of Greece. Luckily, it was on its way to pick up wounded soldiers. Otherwise, it could have been an enormous loss of life. In the end, there were a few people died. A boat capsized, but most of the people actually got off. It was slightly unlucky in that because it was in hot weather. All the windows and portholes were open, and because they'd knocked through all the cabin walls as well to make large airy wards, once the water started getting in, it sank quite rapidly. So it was, had it been as an ocean liner, it may well have survived, but because it had been fitted out the way it was, it didn't. A month after the Titanic sank, W.H. Allen's almost had a bit of a disaster. A large fire broke out. You can see this is the Allen Club here, and this is the houses on Hurst Grove. It started in the pattern shop, and many of the wooden patterns, valuable patterns for some of the biggest contracts, like the Olympic and the Titanic and the Mauritania. Some of them. Not all of them were lost. They managed to get some of them out, but a lot of them were very, very large pieces of wood. So, the next slide. This is the aftermath. So, unfortunately, it would be nice if there was a person standing next to them to get an idea of the size. These are some of the patterns that were rescued, and the ones down the bottom is some of the scene of devastation where everything was burnt out. The actual pattern shop itself is in the back here, and it's only really the first few layers of bricks left of it. It didn't only do liners and for people like Cunard or White Star. They also had massive orders from the Admiralty, and a new class of battleship, the Dreadnoughts, were built from about 1906 onwards, and they supplied machinery for most of them, in forms of pumps and ventilators and electrical equipment. And this is one of the ones which is definitely recorded as having W.H. Allen's equipment on HMS St Vincent. And when the war broke out in August 1914, W.H. Allen had employed about 1,300 workers by that point, of which 300, around about 300, signed up almost immediately in the first few months. W.H. Allen himself lost one of his sons quite early on in the war, who was killed in November 1914. And one of the things that was always a bit of a problem, because everyone was signing up, and once casualties started to mount and people knew or their neighbours had someone who was either injured or killed, people who were of working age and seemed to be fit, people were saying, why aren't you going off to war, fight for your country? And places like munitions factories and things like that, they had special dispensation that you didn't have to start the work at the war effort was more to them than having to go and fight. And what they actually started doing at the end of 1914 was issuing special badges to workers that say that they're on war service. So if someone stopped them in the street and you saw some strapping 20-year-old who they're thinking, why isn't he at war? Why isn't he fighting for your country? They could say, I'm on war service. I'm actually doing my bit because I'm building the machines that are making the war effort work. To start off with, they were all the same, but later on they actually had individual numbers on. They were told under no circumstances should they be sold or transferred to anyone. Because obviously there could be a bit of a black market and someone sort of stopping getting hassled by under false pretences. But eventually they're all individually numbered. There was a number on the back that so that they knew whose badge belonged to who. 20-acre field in the parish of Bidnam have been available for sale since the early 1900s. This top map is actually sort of about 1900, 1902. In 1915, because of the increase in orders, and there was also the prospect of making Aero engines at Allen's, W.H. Allen purchased the land for £6,000, and this is the land which is just to the north of Old Ford End Road, and became the Allen's Bidnam Works. And this is the layout of what it looked like when it was fully built. And here's part of this under construction. And what they did, they moved out a lot of the dirtier stuff. Foundries, the iron foundry, brass foundry, out to the Bidnam Works, and refurbished the works on the site on Ford End Road. And because a lot of the stuff was very intricate, and they didn't really having sort of dirt and grime and sand and stuff in the was going to cause problems. So most of the Aero engines, the precision work and Aero engines, started being done in the main factory.
So what was the date of that?
This photograph is 1916.
1960. And
Yeah.
where is it?
This is at the Bidnam Works.
This is
The Bidnam Works, yes.
Now, I just thought I'd like to think that the guy with the horse and cart is my grandfather.
Oh, right.
Right. Coles.
Yeah, right,
At that
yes.
stage,
Yes,
he was
yes.
certainly carting with a horse
yes,
and cart.
yes.
So, and of course, they worked a lot for Allen.
Yes,
so,
yes.
So,
It's always possible.
yeah.
It's-
In a better print.
Yes, you can't really see the face
I've
very
got a
well.
better print, it looks like that.
Yes. So Aero engines were made in became a large part of the business. So between March 1916 and November 1918, over 3,000 engines plus spares were delivered. Each engine had over 1,000 parts to them. Much of them were very tiny little bits that had to be screwed in precisely in the right order and into the right position. And most of the parts were actually made on site. Some bits were shipped in from elsewhere, but most of them were actually made on site. And the fiddly process of actually putting them together was considered ideal for the women workers that were taking the place of many of the men who were away serving in the forces. And here's a photograph of a lot of women workers. This is September 1916. It's quite a bunch of them. I'd say at its peak, WH had over 1,000 women workers there, and they worked in almost all departments, from the foundry to the aero engines and office work as well. So around about a third of the workforce by the end of the war was female. So they actually built a new dining hall for women workers. So many of you would probably recognise this building that was next to yes, as the canteen. But it was originally built as a dining hall for the women workers. June 1918, a visit from the King. This is the front of a special souvenir version of the Allen's magazine that was made especially for the visit. And here we have Queen Mary and W.H. Allen walking through by the side of the factory. They didn't just visit W.H. Allen's, they also visited the town centre itself and Bedford School. But the first port of call was W.H. Allen's. Here's a few photographs. The Royal Party leaving the Aero stores. They were presented to various people, either very long-serving members of staff or workers, and also to women workers as well. There's the King being presented to one of the representative of women workers. There's the King inspecting things in the Admiralty Works, and this is the Royal car going down the Works Road. And so this is the backs of the houses on Hurst Grove. And it was we've actually got a copy of this is the Illustrated London News, just after it. So there's a two-page spread on the visit, the royal visit. So it made the major sort of national or London news as well as local news. We've actually got the original copy of the original 2 pages here as well. If anyone wants to have a look at it afterwards. The day after the royal visit, it was announced a 10-acre site near the Biddenham Works would be turned into a recreation ground, which of course eventually ended up as Allen Park. Yeah, it was well fitted out. It had they got some groundsmen in who were some of the top people in the area to level the ground and make sure that the pitches, the cricket pitches, etc., were all top standard. I said they even held a minor counties cricket match, Bedfordshire versus Norfolk, in the early 20s on the ground. So as, you can see the Biddenham Works just in the distance there in the background, behind the picture of the tennis courts and bowling green. And of course there's all sorts of things there. Obviously there's cricket, rugby, hockey, football.
Famous fights.
Yeah, yes, yeah. And they had,
of the workers.
yes, yeah, and they had their own shooting range at the back. A wide variety of things of various sports that could take place there.
Was that actually at Allen Park?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
right. Oh.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And this is a painting of the site around about 1920, just after the First World War. You see the slightly fanciful All Saints Church with the spire, the tower and spire. That was the original drawings was for it to have a tower and a spire, roughly, well, here. It's on the front bit here. But obviously money wasn't available for that, so they've still actually put it in the drawing. It's a bit of artistic license there.
That factory's far more advanced than that picture, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. This is from the early 20s now.
And that was by his brother, wasn't it? Alan's brother.
Sorry,
What was by the painting is by an
Yes.
Alan, isn't it?
yeah, it's an ad. Yes. It's also on the front of the book, the colour version of it. This is the W.H. Allen stand at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley, 1923. That was one of the really big post-war, post-First World War exhibitions. It was what Wembley Stadium was built for, and Wembley Arena and everything like that. The whole site was built for the British Empire exhibition. And as you can see, it's quite a substantial stand. It's not some little cubby hole with showing a few bits and pieces that they sell. There were some quite large bits of machinery. It went quite a way back, apparently, according to the review of the stand. Well, in 1926, September 1926. William Henry Allen died at Bromham House. This is a memorial plaque that was done for him, and it was unveiled on the side of the factory building in Ford End Road in October 1927. And not everyone knows that the plaque can still be seen. There is a hedge in front of it now, which is a bit higher than it used to be when I took these photographs. I took that bottom photograph a couple of years ago. But it's actually on a house in Hurst Grove, about 2 houses up from the Allen Club. There's a little road into the estate that's been built on the site of the factory, and it's on, as you face towards the railway, it's on the left-hand side. It's on the front of the building. It's one of the show homes for the estate that was built there. But it's really quite a nice plaque. It's mellowed a bit and sort of kind of, it's got its verdigris and sort of kind of a bit greenish. But I think it actually possibly looks better than I know the other one's a black and white photograph. It does actually look. It still looks quite well on. It's set into the brickwork on the front of the house. Of course, the other thing that not many people know is that the original gates from Ford End Road, they are also in that estate. There's a little play area with children's playthings, and there's the gates have actually been set up in the middle of the grass by the side of the play area. And again, that's just off of Hurst Grove, right in the middle of the estate.
They're not the same plaque, are they?
Yes, I think it is. Well, they said it was.
If you look in particular at his head, it's a different head.
It's worn.
No, it's a
He's
different
got glasses on
Yes.
the bottom, but they haven't got glasses on the top.
Yeah.
So
It's a different plaque.
or they've restored it or been...
No, it's a different one.
A different one completely different.
Yeah, well, not completely, though.
Yeah.
One's a copy of the other, isn't it?
Yes. Well, you think it's made from the same mould?
Well, no, that's not the same.
His eyes were a lot better than that one.
As you say, glasses is one.
But if it is a replica, it's been made
You sure it doesn't
made
say
from. It must have been made from the original. Well, this is a picture of the original one being unveiled. Quite high up on the wall. It moved several times because it was in the new office building at one point as well. But I was always under the impression, someone actually told me that they actually got the original one and they used it as a relic of the factory. I know unless it's just weathered.
No, if you
think it's
later, look at the original photos.
Yeah.
You'll see that.
So the new sports pavilion and changing rooms, built in 1929-1930, ready for the 1930 summer season, and actually had 8 changing rooms with a big bath for the dirtier sports. And this is the one that most people, obviously these have gone now as well, but this is the one that most people would be familiar with. It's quite a bit bigger than the original ones that have been built 10 or so years earlier. And I put the picture of the ladies hockey team up because although many of after the First World War, a lot of the women workers were laid off, there was still enough women workers there to put a hockey team together at least, and there was still a fair proportion of women workers all throughout the 1930s and 40s. In October 1929 they opened an exhibition hall which was designed so they could show off historic bits of machinery and mementos of their past, and also they could show off a range of their current goods as well. So if there was people visiting potential clients who potentially might be buying some of their equipment, they could actually see their range. In 1935, when the Mauritania was scrapped, lots of their internal parts of the Mauritania were sold off very cheaply, and W.H. Allen's bought a pair of pumps, brought them back to Bedford, and then found they wouldn't fit inside the hall. Yeah, this is the door. Although that's a high door, again it's a pity there's not a person by the side of it. Apparently they were about 12 to 13 foot high. So I think these doors are probably about 10 foot high, something like that. But they couldn't. It didn't fit in. It wouldn't fit inside the exhibition hall, so they placed it outside instead. And here's just 4 aerial views of Allen's, the Ford End Road, the main factory, and the Bidnam Works. These were all taken around 1929 to 1931 by Aero films. They actually took, there's actually quite a few more in the series, but I just chose 4, two of each factory. And as you can see, at that time the Bidnam Works was quite substantial. I think both the bottom ones are 1932, I think that's 1929 and 1931, the two at the top. And of course, All Saints Church, where you are now, is that building there. When there used to be houses on the other side of the road. The 30s was difficult for most people at most places in the country. Allen's wasn't quite as badly off as many industries further north and in the more industrial areas, but orders had slumped, and they decided that quite early on, about 1933, that they would start moving the equipment from the Bidnam Works over to the main factory, and by 1937, they actually had a buyer for the land, and it was sold off for housing. This map is from 1939, and you see Chestnut Avenue and the Burnham Avenue have been built. The rest of it is still undeveloped, and the sort of the rump of the Bidnam Works is just this little section on the end. And this is an advert for one of the houses. This is from 1938 of the Queen's Park Estate. Show house is now open, and we see some quite interesting prices. £500 cost of the house, freehold, or it was £25 deposit and 12 shillings and 11 pence a week for your mortgage. Well, that's basically come to the end of the talk. A little bit, I've got about 10 minutes. If anyone's got any questions about anything that we've talked about?
Very interesting about the gates you said, and now in that new estate.
Yes, yes.
They're still there.
They're still there, yes.
But we don't often go through there.
No,
in
no.
order to inspire people.
No.
Because it is a site specifically for housing.
Yes,
So
yeah.
we've not seen the gates.
No,
I didn't know they
yeah,
were
but
there.
they are
Black.
there.
Painted black.
They've been painted black. There's just there's the two gates plus
And they're the
the
original gates.
they're the
from
original
front
gates that
down
were
as well.
from the front. Yes, yeah. It's also got there's the bit that comes out at an angle, isn't there, on each side? But they're stopped just by themselves in the middle of a grassy bit of field.
When the Aero engines finished production, was
Yes.
that the end of Bitten Works then?
No, the Bidden work still carried on until the 1930s, but there was less and less work
Yeah.
going on there.
But
So
it was
the-
mainly for the Aero production.
no, the Aero engines were mainly made in the main factory. They moved all the dirty stuff, the
They
foundries.
they used the Bedford for testing.
They did a lot of testing, yes, they did. They used a lot of
All
testing.
the products they made were sent there for you to-
But the Aero engines, the actual Aero factory was in the main works. Yeah, yeah. W.H. Allen's eldest grandson, who was he was the person they were hoping was going to carry on the business. He was killed testing an aircraft just outside Ipswich and Melville Allen, and it's possible that W.H. Allen didn't have the heart for Aero engines anymore after that.
Yeah.
Melville Allen had been expensively educated at Harrow, Trinity College, Cambridge. He'd served in the cavalry for a short period of time, but he obviously pulled some strings, and he ended up doing testing of aircraft and various combinations of engine and aircraft. It's not recorded whether it was one of Allen's own engines. It was an engine problem, though. The engine the plane stalled and it crashed near an airfield just outside Ipswich. The book actually says it's in Norfolk, but it's definitely in Suffolk. It's only a couple of miles outside Ipswich where the crash was. And when it got to when the war finished in November 1918, and the contract stopped for making for the military, he decided that was it. No Aero engines, which is a pity in some ways, because it could have been a major. It was one of the biggest aero engine manufacturers in the country.
They're obviously built under licence.
Under licence is that's quite an interesting thing, because the engines were called La Rhone, French, originally a French manufacturer. The French made them, the British made them under licence, and the Germans made them as well. It's exactly the same design. So an awful lot of the planes that fought in World War I were from both sides using the same engines.
Were they all rotary engines?
They were rotary engines, yes, yeah. It's one of these things that in wartime we quite often get major advances in all sorts of things. So at the beginning of the First World War, planes were underpowered, very flimsy, and pretty well useless for almost anything. And the original ones that were used to in any sort of war effort, they basically carried a very small number of tiny bombs that they used to just drop over the side. By the end of the war, there were proper bombers. Particularly the Germans had proper bombers. The speed and the resilience of the fighter planes increased endlessly. They ended up 4 years later, at the end of the war, proper fighting aircraft, whereas before they were basically just sort of made of wood and wood and string, yes, and very underpowered engines. The types of engines that Allen's made were all basically the same, but they increased in horsepower a lot throughout through the life of the factory as the war progressed, which has made bigger and more powerful.
Remember also that all the things Allen's made over the years, they also had contracts for servicing. They used to come
Oh
back
yes,
away,
yes,
so
oh yes.
their jobs were for life. Once
Oh
they
yes,
made
yes, because
They make
as I say,
things so damn good.
they make all the spare
They
parts.
needed
So
re-
one of the things about the Mauritania, this pump, when it came back into the works, they actually measured some of the bearings and things like that, and actually found, even though it had been I actually had some figures of how many miles that it had actually gone and how many times it must have actually turned over. And it was only between 19 and 20 thousandths of an inch out from the original specification. So it was hardly any wear and tear, and it had been in service from 1907 until 1935.
And that was the quality of what they
Yes,
made.
quality of what they made, yes, yeah.
What would you do if you want to get your
Sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry?
If
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
Cheers, thanks.
you want to have your irons good service now, what do you do?
If anyone's still got Alan's equipment, I suppose. There's a lot of there's a lot in museums. If you wanted Alan's services now, you probably wouldn't be done by whether Rolls-Royce would do anything for some of the later stuff.
The pipeline across India,
Because obviously you've got, sorry.
the pipeline across India still working?
Yes, yeah, I know. That's one of the things. They did pumps for irrigation and things like that. Which there's certainly stories that the pumps that they made for irrigation in Egypt around 1900 are still actually there.
And turbines.
And turbine, yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean obviously a lot of the ships and things that had the ships have been scrapped. The engines themselves have probably been scrapped, but there's almost certainly a few around in various places.
I'm afraid it was when things were made.
There's only one. There's actually just one other thing I was just going to talk about. I'm actually giving another talk next Saturday at the Higgins on engineering in Queen's Park during the First World War. So it will just be the First World War. It won't just be Allen's, but it will be mainly Allen's. They used to have, there were quite a few of these leaflets around, but I think they've either withdrawn them because it actually says free entry at the top, and it's not. It's free entry to. They've got an exhibition on at the Higgins at the moment called Bedford's War Machines, which covers a couple of companies in the Bedford area that produced stuff for war during the First World War, and that is free. But the talk that I'm doing, I didn't have anything to do with the price of that. It's £5.30 or £4.20 for concessions, so it's more than we would normally charge. But it's 11:30 on next Saturday at the Higgins. If anyone's interested in that, and I say at the moment I'm just putting the presentation together. There will be a few bits from this that will be very similar. That I'm trying to do, make sure that I've actually put more, because it's only really 4 years I'm talking about. There's going to be in much greater detail on a much wider variety of photographs and information about it.
We ought to get
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Jack.
ought to get that their own engine that's at Shuttleworth.
Yes.
I mean, they Shuttleworth are not. It's shown properly.
No,
It all
no.
come back to the Higgins.
Yes, I think so. So, and then there's the mystery one, the silver plated one. That we don't really know what happened to that.
There was one, Bill Bailey took one,
So,
the Derby, Francis Bailey.
yeah.
He had one that used to be in the glass cabinet in the entrance hall.
Oh, right.
Where?
Francis Bailey, his dad had the coaches at Turley.
Yeah.
He was a pattern maker.
And he took the one that's,
He
this is
took
the one,
the
this is the
one that
mysterious
passed
one that's
in the
disappeared.
Yeah, I don't know where that went.
In the entrance, where was it exhibited? Sorry.
In the main office block.
It was in the office block, in the
Okay.
entrance.
Alan's office.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably not.
No, well, I know the whereabouts of several. There's one in Newcastle, a museum in Newcastle. There's one in Glasgow. So there's one in Shuttleworth. There was definitely more around, but some of them seem to. Maybe they've gone into storerooms and back.